Okay, there we go. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special lecture from the SPD Social Policy and Development International Programme at the Faculty of Social Administration at Thammasat University here in Bangkok. My name is Pred Evans, and I'm the Assistant Dean for International Affairs at the faculty, and also I lecture on the SPD programme. And I'm pleased to say that we've a diverse range of participants from all over the region and the world, ranging from undergraduates and postgraduates to academics and our partners as well, including the Ministry of Social Development and Human Security in Thailand. So I'd just like to say thank you all for joining us today. And just a little bit of an explanation that this lecture is one of a series of webinars we're holding throughout the year. And we bring in experts in a wide range of fields which tackle urgent social issues to share their knowledge with us. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Amber McKinley as our special guest today. Welcome, Amber. Dr. McKinley is a clinical and forensic victimologist and senior lecturer at Charles Sturt University's Australian Graduate School of Policing and Security. And she brings a wealth of experience as a global expert. And today, Dr. McKinley is going to be sharing with us her insights on the topic of human trafficking. Just before I hand over the floor to Dr. McKinley, I'd like to ask you all to make sure that your mics are muted during the session. And if you have any questions, please do post them into the chat box, or you can also ask them directly because we'll be having a Q&A session later on. So that's it from me. Dr. McKinley, a very, very warm welcome to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I am honoured to have been asked to be part of this presentation. Just bear with me as I start my screen here. I'm hoping I've got this right.
Yes, we can see.
Yeah, we good?
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Maybe you could, is it possible to make it bigger?
Just bear with me. I'm looking at a full screen. Pred, I'm sorry.
Okay, it's not full screen. We can see the slides on the side. But
oh, okay. That's not what I can see. Sorry, bear with me again.
No worries, no worries.
Are you getting full screen now?
No, not yet. No. Oh,
okay.
No.
No, okay, bear with me for a second. I'm seeing two different things on different screens, so let's have a look and see what we can do here. Forgive me,
No problem. We can see it quite clearly, but it's got the slides as well on the side, that's all.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. Bear with me for 2 seconds. I just want to make sure that I see all slides. Forgive me, this is not one I'm used to. Full screen. I am so sorry.
No problem, not at all. It's oh yeah, we can see now the
Is that working for you now? There's a full screen?
I think it's in the process. That's it. You've got it. It's full screen now. Yeah.
Perfect. Forgive me, everyone. I might be good at victimology, but technology might be my failing. So yes, here I am. The presentation that I'm doing today, I guess what I'd like you to know is that during my work as an academic, I have tried to get out into the field. So I work with many different agents around the world, policing, defence, militaries, private groups. I have had the honour of working with the FBI, the Federal Police in Australia, and a wonderful colleague of mine that joins us tonight from Global Arms, the CEO, Michelle Moore. She is actually in Thailand, and I have been working with Michelle for quite some period of time. But I suppose the reason I'm showing you this is to let you know that although I have degrees to back up my knowledge, I suppose I get out in the field and I work with people that are doing this on a daily basis. And I think the practical aspects is what I'd like to work with you and present you with today. So I just got 4 learning objectives. It is an hour and I don't want to bombard you. I don't read the slides, so you are welcome, please, to just read those as we go along. And I will provide Pred with a sample of these at the end, minus just a couple of the photographs. But I would like to put up a warning. This is a very graphic presentation and it does have victim stories in it. So if there are any concerns from students or staff, please contact the most appropriate representative from your group. So the presentation that I'm doing today is basically surrounding 3 particular types of human trafficking. That is for sexual servitude, labour and forced marriage. The reason I chose those for this presentation is those are ones that we are finding most significant in Australia, both where our victims are trafficked here from other nations, but also where we are actually losing our own Australian people to go to other countries. As you know, human trafficking is a global problem and is critical in the sense that it robs people of their dignity. Men and literally millions of people. Traffickers deceive men and women and children from all corners of the globe. They force them into exploitative situations every day. Whilst the best known forms of human trafficking is forced sexual exploitation, hundreds and thousands of people are trafficked annually for forced labour, domestic servitude, and of course child begging. The current numbers, well, those that I was able to get from 2020, look at having 40.3 million victims in the world. This number is extraordinary to me and should be to you when we consider that the population of Australia, as an example, is 23 million. So almost double our entire population, or just under double, excuse me. I think what we have to remember here, and it's something that I teach throughout the world, is that we must keep the human in the term human trafficking. Because as you will see from slides that are provided further along, we talk about the cost, we talk about profits to those who will harm people and set out to earn money off the pain of other human beings. But we must remember that it is humans that are involved, whether from the offence point of view or the victims. The reason that I studied victimology for, this is my 30th year in the field of victimology, is because it takes a victim of crime right from the very point of that crime being discovered all the way through to either a court case or media, anything where you having interactions with the criminal justice system, social justice, NGOs, church groups, or so on. I use Claire Ferguson's definition there because I think it's one of the best. It's about relationships and the scientific study of that. And it is important because we can use science and the words of victims, their statements, their stories to add the human to these numbers that you're looking at here. The UNODC, or the UN's Office of Drugs and Crime, produced this infographic, and it's one that I guess to some extent frightens me to think that this was in 2017, and as I mentioned to you in the previous slide, it's now 40 million people. So it's doubled since this infographic was produced. If you think about nearly 3/4 of all of those victims are women and girls, I think it's an extraordinary shame. And the fact is that we should remember that for these women and girls that are trafficked for labour or even sex and exploitation, we must consider that companies that do it, that are involved in it, whether legal or illegal, such as brothels who are registered in certain countries, pay tax and so on, but are doing the wrong thing by hiring these women and girls who have been trafficked, must be considered as criminals themselves. If the company is deemed unethical or have unethical behaviours, people that are using these services, buying into this and supporting them, have to be considered as criminals themselves, because it is the demands that they have is driving the supply of these numbers of people. If you consider things like labour trafficking, and we see there that it's around about the 40% mark, I often ask my students, who mostly are military or police, where are the clothes that you're wearing on your back right now? Where are they made? How do we know what these companies are doing? What do we know about what ethics these companies have? Are they sweatshop based? Do we know whether the people are unwilling participants in, producing these products en masse? And sadly, Australia is definitely a country of demand. Between fashion, the need for new technologies, sadly the need for sex, in terms of the way we exploit people through film, pornography, child exploitation material. Unfortunately, we, in terms of the people that have been convicted, are in the top 3% of the crimes are against children. These are the types of human trafficking that we see in the Southeast Asian and Australian region, in the Oceania region. I haven't had any that I am aware of organ theft locally. However, we know that forced prostitution and marriage, forced begging, and labour are substantial crimes. We also know, unfortunately, that we have very, very low numbers in prosecution. What needs to be added into this infographic, and I'm working on doing that at the moment, is cyber and the cyber sex crimes that we are seeing with technology facilitated agents of human trafficking, exploiting women and children through cyber crimes. So who are involved? We have basically 4 known groups. And I think the one we need to start with, if I'm honest, is actually the end, and that is the consumer. Because if we didn't consume at the rate that we do, there would be no demand, and so there would be no need of a supply pool, which is literally made of human beings. We look at those consumers, and what I think is our future and what we need to do through our universities, our policing, and our governments, is to slow that process of demand, to educate people that people are truly suffering, in fact losing their lives, and we need to make them aware that it is actually individuals involved, as opposed to perhaps these, because the numbers are so enormous, I think people get lost in that mist, if you like. We have the recruiters, who are almost always known to the victims, particularly in nations where, as an example, they can speak their same language, they know the cultural norms, and they can come into areas and exploit those that are desperately in need. And I'll show you in a minute those risk factors that we know. The traffickers, who are usually higher up that organisational chain, but also noting that in some cases, and certainly ones that I'm aware of, these aren't large organised crime organisations. They are not large numbers of people in hierarchical groups, although they do exist. Some of them are people who are saying, we have a large family, we are unable to feed our families, we are looking to sell our children into some form of to smuggle them across borders or into trafficking groups. I think the other thing we must remember is that 75% that we talked about earlier, being women and girls. And here this infographic should show you why they are women. Globally, 1 in 5 victims of human trafficking are children. although in the poorer regions and sub-regions such as Africa and the greater Mekong area, they make up the majority of trafficked persons, which I think is often overlooked, certainly by academia. Children are exploited for the purposes of forced begging, child pornography and sex. The children are sometimes favoured as labourers, as they are deemed easier to manipulate, but also easier to control. Think about things like picking cocoa, sewing luxury goods, untangling fishing nets, getting into small areas in construction. Children are also enslaved as child soldiers in war zones. Women make up 2/3 of this population. The vast majority of those females are young. They are usually lured into with false promises of employment, assaulted, drugged, and imprisoned, beaten, threatened with violence, and almost always have a debt imposed on them. In these cases, certainly the ones we've seen in Australia, their passports are removed and they're often blackmailed. Things such as, we know where your family is, we will shame you, we will name you, but we will also harm them. In the case of men and boys, they can't be forgotten. They are around the 30-odd%, depending on what agency you're working with. They are often used for the purposes of forced labour, forced begging, and sometimes sexual exploitation. But in many of the nations that I've dealt with, in places like Africa, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, they are also child soldiers. The percentage of identified males victims are disproportionately lower to women for a number of reasons, those that are on your screen, but also that many of the anti-human trafficking legislations around the world have actually focused on trafficking women and children, or for the trafficking of sexual exploitation, of which most victims are women. Excuse me. So there is no real single or typical victim profile, and that's something that has taken a lot of people a lot of time to get their head around. Cases are seen all over the world where victims are targeted irrespective of their gender or their age or their background. Children, for example, might be trafficked in Eastern or Western Europe for the purposes of begging or being a pickpocket, whereas young girls in Africa may be deceived from promises of modelling. We're seeing that in the Ukraine due to the crisis that's happening there. Au pair jobs that come from Europe to find themselves trapped into sexual exploitation or domestic servitude. Women in Asia have been known to be tricked with promises of legitimate work, which has led to virtual imprisonment and abuse. And men and women alike are trafficked throughout South and North America and made to work in things like farm work and labouring. So when we think about the risks and losses that are associated with victimology and knowing what the victims go through, I've tried to list these here in two separated columns. For all of the victims of trafficking on the left-hand side of the screen, these are the the most general risks that we see. And specific to sex trafficking and exploitation are the ones on the right hand side, and of course they can blend over. The critical aspect here is that for most victims of human trafficking that I have either reviewed court documentation on or met and conversed with, it is the idea of the incredible shame and the stigma that has gone that they feel based on the fact that they were entrapped or coerced. They feel extraordinary shame, and the stigma they hold is a concern for returning back to their communities. So in many cases, the women in particular that I have dealt with have chosen not to return to the community that they came from. In terms of identifying victims, these are some the major ones that we can use to know on literally how to spot a potential or identify a potential victim. But there's other things such as no official paperwork, distrust in service providers we see, lies or false stories where the stories when separated from the group or from their controllers, they don't match up. They are untrustworthy of interpreters, or the interpreter will say something is wrong with their story. They have no control over their personal identification papers, few or little personal possessions. They often are forced to have a third party being present when they're interviewed. And often we see signs of branding. This is something we see in specific areas where there may be an organised crime group, and the women that are sexually trafficked will actually be branded or tattooed. It's an extraordinary tragedy for the women to then carry that scar, if you like, with them, because it's not only the mental and physical things that they have been through and their experiences, but they are also tattooed for life. And even if that tattoo was surgically removed, of course, then the surgery scar reminds them that something was there. So, oh, excuse me. So this is what we see in Australia sex trafficking looks like. So I've listed here the places that we would see, but I want to add to that, because since COVID has hit, there's been a lot more of the cyber sex chats and exploitation. We have things where they are moved from sex trafficking into domestic servitude, kept as a servant, a nanny, or a housekeeper, but then is forced to have sex with the homeowners. Modelling agencies where they may do some modelling, but then it is sexualised, and they are forced to do acts that they don't wish to do. We also have things such as restaurant workers, servants, and so on, again, when they're moved into escort services after their first role, or they come to do their first role. There is also dancing, exotic dancing, and so on. The risk factors, the risk factors here are quite general across the most victims of trafficking, you'll see, have these in common, but the poverty is probably the beginning of it, and the lack of education. Research that I did in the Mekong area showed that the average child left school just before their 8th birthday. And what that told us was they were unable to be literate in their own languages. They were also extraordinarily vulnerable to coercion and manipulation by people older or more knowledgeable. There was also the concept that those children who needed special education or had either disabilities or had learning disabilities were excluded from the mainstream because they'd been taken away at such a young age. When we think about the risk factors here, in fact, we know now, and in most countries, we know that we can affect a lot of these things. I've been talking to some different countries about things like, once the main COVID wave moved through their nations, they had set up and spent a huge amount of money in health and well-being, new buildings, associated health, allied health services, and so on. And one of the things that we talked about was utilizing some of those services that were perhaps not as much needed at the moment, to assist victims of human trafficking, both from a medical but also a mental health point of view. The idea of not having to re-spend money, but to use what was already available. A new theory, or a recent theory that I have coined and come up with, was the concept of conditional vulnerability. Myself and a brilliant colleague of mine have been writing about this, and will publicly release an article in 2023. The concept of conditional vulnerability is taking four of the most well-known victimological theories, which is lifestyle theory from the late 1970s, deviant place theory from Stark in 1987, the victim precipitation from Wolfgang in 1957, and the routine activity theory, which was from 1979, and Felsen and Cohen from the United States coined created that theory, was to blend these. So we have four victimological theories from at least sort of between 50 and 70 years old. But what we found is that they only spoke to one portion of the victimology, one portion of the vulnerability. So what we did, we have taken the critical points of each of these and created conditional vulnerability. And you can see here by the definition that we've come up with that it is a dynamic risk, that the people go through specific conditions which make them more likely to become vulnerable victims. I look forward to producing that article with Emma and getting that out there, and I hope that you have an opportunity to read it. So in terms of victim vulnerability factors, I've shown you things such as education and poverty, gender and age. These are some of the more specifics where we look at more complex issues around those factors. Victims are often completely unaware of resources, of laws. They have a lack of the ability, or are geographically isolated, for example, or motivation where they may be reluctant to contact police. So they don't take advantage of them, which makes them absolutely more vulnerable to this type of crime. And it also increases the risk of any interpersonal violence. Victims with inadequate physical security, such as unsafe housing, their workplace or transportation, who continue to reside with a perpetrator, excuse me, are also at much higher risk of interpersonal violence. Also, those that are physically unwell or mentally unwell, they may be substance abuse, unemployment, or legal problems that increase their feelings of helplessness and vulnerability, such as being stateless, for example. If they have crossed borders, having been smuggled to escape either civil wars or other problems, they have real problems with self-protection. Entering a country illegally, being stateless or paperless puts them much more vulnerable, and in a state where they can be vulnerable for basically their period of time that they remain there. You'll see on the left-hand side, or the left column here, I have listed individual factors where it where it affects the individual person. And then I've tried to add to that community risk factors. We need to think about lifestyle, so the victim's lifestyle and their individual risk as listed here can help investigators, so those in police or other agencies, to actually locate the perpetrator or even identify them if the victim is unable to. It looks at situational motives. So if that person is vulnerable under those type of risk factors, it can also help us understand the social structural issues in the area that they are, or whether they are institutionally victimized, such as they may be in an institution such as a home. We have here in Australia what is known as out-of-home care for children that cannot be cared by their biological parents. This also increases risk. We also, on this slide, I've taken it to the family risk factors and those within peer groups. As you'll see throughout these particular slides, academic performance and education is absolutely key. And the reason is we understand that even if the person is an adult when they're trafficked, the lack of education gives them a lack of critical thinking. And it isn't their fault. It's because they just don't know that what is happening to them is manipulation. They may not be literate in their own nation's languages. They may also be culturally illiterate if they've come from, say, for example, a regional or mountainous area and are moved to a city and just don't know. So I think it is key to remember that education is the bedrock of how we are going to slow and hopefully one day eradicate human trafficking from the world. The next slide that I have is about a question, I suppose, and I know this presentation is happening quite quickly, and forgive me, I've got a lot to get through, but I want you to kind of think about what drives us. I've talked about our country shamefully being a large demand nation, as are many around the world. For us, the simple answer to that is pornography. In terms of the sexual exploitation of women and children, victims here our demand is driven by more and more people logging on to pornography, wanting more in pornography. It is no longer something where they're prepared to just do a film, for example, online. What they want to do is download. They want to interact, which is critical in terms of the way we police this. That as I've spoken to my colleagues, both here and in Thailand, the driving force of pornography cannot be policed. I wish it was different. In Australia, we have a situation, I'm sure it may be happening in your own nations as well, is our police just cannot keep on top of this. We may be able to seek out those who are online in cyber land with child exploitation. However, when we're talking about something that you can download for free on your phone or any other device within seconds, I do not believe we can police it. So one of the research projects that we are looking at the moment is the concept of semiology. Semiology is the science of social harm, of studying social harm. So what I'm doing is looking at pornography from the point of view of creating long-term social harm. You can see here on the slide that I've put up there the physical, I suppose, and the assaultive outcomes. But one of the things that we don't consider enough of is extreme mental illness, leading to often suicidal ideation and sadly to fatal ends. We know our women that are in these situations have massive problems with depression and anxiety, with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, panic attacks, fear and distrust, and often what is known as Stockholm syndrome, where, of course, the victims of these horrific crimes start to believe in their perpetrators and offenders, and in some cases, in fact, join the perpetrators in their work and go out to enhance other women and attract and engage other women to come into these organized groups. The next two slides are actually graphic in terms of scarring, so please either black your screen or look away if you're concerned. It's around the wrist, excuse me. I just wanted you to understand that our victims don't ever forget whether it is mental or physical scarring. The experiences are unforgettable. But in cases like this, we literally see people scarred for life. I talked about tattooing and so on, but in some cases, people are so terribly harmed. And I guess this is the reason that I keep saying to people that I talk to about this, never ever forget the human in human trafficking, because what we see here is something that they will, I would suspect, never get over. Moving through to labour and the concept of supply and demand. More and more companies, particularly here in Australia, but I know in your own nations, are trying to go into ethical supply, are looking at what's in their chain, production chains. They're looking at things like insurance companies going for ethical investments and so on. When we talk about what drives demand. This is what I told you I asked my students or the officers that I work with. Where are the clothes that you're wearing on your back right now? Where did they come from? I think for most of us, we don't know. We purchased them at a store. We bought them secondhand. We got them online. Our demand for new and fashionable things, for uniforms, for to stand out, to be influenced by influencers, to be the in girl, that girl, to be considered to be well off, drives this supply, and the supply doesn't seem to be able to end, because even things like here in Australia, we're supposed to be heading towards summer. It's actually quite cold for us here, but as we move into out of our spring and into summer, we go into different cloth, we go into different styles, and of course those that are far more fashionable than me know that there's specific colors you need, specific outfits that we want. Nobody ever steps back and says, where did that come from? Who made it? And at what cost was it? Because I know, as a mother of a teenager who is outgrowing me quicker than I can keep up, the amount of clothes we need and the amount of money we're prepared to spend is often not equitable. And it's certainly not for those that are caught in forced situations. So what I mean by in terms of labour trafficking about control and force is these three things. Force is one of them, fraud is the other, and coercion is the other. And please feel free to read the slide. When we talk about force, think about things like kidnapping, threatening, battering, threats of weapons, threats of sexual abuse or even sexual abuse, confinement, forced use of drugs and alcohol, and also forced abortions for those that are unfortunate enough to sadly become pregnant due to their assault. When we talk about the forced use of drugs, be under no delusions. We have situations where we know about people that have been trafficked, placed into confinement, and force-fed heroin to the point that they become addicted. Then the doors are open and they're allowed to go about their daily business. Anybody here that's listening today that knows anything about drug addiction, science or health would know that once they're addicted to heroin, they are unable to deal without it. What happens is they return back to the fold pretty quickly and are prepared to do whatever it takes to get that daily hit. So this is what I consider to be not only force but coercion as well. The person has no actual ability to get away. When we talk about coercion as well, think about things like debt bondage, threats and harm to the victim themselves, but also to their family back home, the control of children, the control of their communications. Here in Australia, we have very, very remote areas. Our country's population is about 23.5 million, and we are an enormous nation. So when you go into our remote regions, mobile phones don't work, GPSs don't always work. We can use things like, we know that people hold their ID or their travel documents, but what about things like photographing them in an illegal situation, where that's then used to coerce them to behave again, because that crime could be something that they could be arrested for. Punishments for misbehavior and continuous fining them keeps them in a forced labor position as well. I mentioned earlier that I work in different areas, and these are some of them where my research takes me. And I guess some of the important parts to me are the newer areas that I've been learning about and working in is trafficking in conflict areas. Obviously, working in this area for such a long time, I understand that conflict is the thing that makes people more vulnerable. But if you think about right now with the wars in Ukraine and Russia, also the civil disturbances in Burma or Myanmar, and also those that have been left behind in Afghanistan and in the bordering nations there, people have been in conflict for a long time, and it goes in that ebb and flow, where the vulnerable who were already vulnerable, such as women and children who have been left behind are hungry, are cold, or the opposite in extreme heat, are in unsafe housing such as tent cities, or actually on the move across nations, are something that we have to consider as we educate police and our students in terms of maybe future research projects. We have to consider that each individual area holds with it its own conditional vulnerabilities. I'm at the last couple of slides, and like I said, I apologize for speeding through this given time limits, but I wanted to talk to you about what I think we can do for our future. The prevention and protection and prosecution, of course, are critical. But I think when we know that our prosecution numbers in this country are very, very low, although the police are extraordinary, they work amazing hours. They are dedicated individuals. I have the great honor of working with them and teaching them. I am very aware that they often feel like they have failed. So we start to talk about how do they measure success. And those of you that are out there working in the field or teaching students, or if you're students studying this, if you're in government agencies, start to think about how we can measure success differently. If it's not about the prosecution, was it about saving lives? Was it altering or expanding victim services? Was it making people more aware of where their clothing came from so that people start to question things more than they have ever done before? We have to think about collaboration and agencies. And if any of you out there are listening to this either now or in a recording, pick up the phone or email me. We are always looking for times to collaborate with other agencies or people who are interested in working with us. Think about creating and evaluating protocols and different procedures that we either have in law or in policy, because sometimes those things have not moved quick enough, such as the ones that were before COVID, during COVID, and now where we're in that during COVID point has changed the way we do our business. Sadly, it hasn't changed a lot in terms of the criminality. The last two slides are about our future. So what does the future look like? I think for me, if we think about policy-orientated recommendations, we have to think about the implementation of gaps or even identifying the gaps. We have to look at it like a roadmap. And that's what Michelle and I are trying to work out, and looking at different ways and different means of looking at this same information. Looking at protecting victims, whether it's groups of them that we know will be possible, such as children in a school group or particular minority groups in certain countries. Think about coordinated collaboration. Those of you that are in education and academia, can we get out there and do more research together? Can we start interacting with police and border force agencies? Look at outdated things, and can we help move with change? But the important one for me is that evidence-based. Getting the evidence-based approach where we can prove the success and prove our own failures. Chart the courses that require the change and look at modifications and how we do our business. The last one, and it's with great pride that I tell you I was part of a documentary movie that was made. If you go onto YouTube, you can access this for free. It's called Trafficked to Australia. I have put the URL there, but a simple Google search will do it. This amazing group of filmmakers came to us and interviewed the federal police, border force, myself and other people involved. I would be really honoured if you would watch that film. It goes for slightly less than an hour. You can stop and start, but have a look at it, please. We want to spread the word and we want interaction. That's it for me, Pred. I will stop sharing and let you take over.
Great. Thank you very much, Amber, for that very sobering but highly insightful and informative lecture on what's, of course, a very pressing and important and tragic social issue. of human trafficking. I'd now like to therefore open the floor for any questions that our participants might have, whether it's a question that you'd like to ask directly, or whether it's something that you'd prefer, if you're a little bit shy, to put into the chat box, that's also fine. So please do take this opportunity to ask for any clarification, or simply to give your own comments or thoughts on the topic of human trafficking. I know there's a lot of different kind of experiences in the room, in the meeting, as it were. Right, we have one here in the chat box. So this is from our director of the SPD program, Dr. Sorasic. Thank you very much for your comprehensive presentation. Can you show us an example of Australian current key social policy to cope with human trafficking?
Thank you for your question. Yes, we do. The social policy that we have in place has been rewritten and is being modified, but certainly in our universities and so on, we are looking at engaging people on the ground, working with those in NGOs, in medical, and engaging our students at a much younger level to be involved, to work with people on the ground, either working in education programs, or working with police as getting information from police and working into the social policies, so that when we engage our victim services, that it is more appropriate for them. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Amber. I now have a question which I'm just going to, is coming through a separate channel from someone. So this person asks, there are cases that trafficked victims themselves commit or are forced to commit crimes related to their victimization. So, for example, prostitution, falsification of documents. And this seems unjust. What safeguard measures or frameworks, legal or social, are there to protect or to support them?
I can answer directly from Australia on that one. I know our police engage social services when a victim is picked up. So I'll give you an example. We have one where 8 women were trafficked from Thailand. They were definitely coerced and exploited. In many of the 8 women, they were in services in your own country, in massage parlors, in nail salons, and so on. Only one of the women was a sex worker. When they arrived in Australia, they were taken by a husband and wife team, and they were put into sexual servitude in a legal brothel here in Australia, but illegally kept. What happened when the police engaged with them was those women had been forced to do illegal acts, and yes, you are correct, to lie and falsify documents. So what they did was they treated them separately. So what they looked at was the victimization of the women, and the original criminal act was taken by police and investigated, and the original offenders were charged and committed to trial and were eventually sentenced to jail. And then the women were counselled, gave opportunities with psychologists and so on, and those crimes were they were acquitted of all, because it was under that false act that they, under exploitation, that they had to do that.
Right, thank you, Amber. And we have a message and a question here from Dr. Pion. Thank you, Amber. I hope you stay optimistic in such heavy research. What are the main source countries of human trafficking to Australia? And what are the main misconceptions of human trafficking among your military and police students?
Oh, excellent question. Thank you. Sadly, the Mekong area and India are our main source countries. And our, sorry, Pred, could you just repeat the last part of the question in terms of our military and police? Oh, I can't hear you. Sorry, you're on mute.
Apologies.
So,
What are the main misconceptions of human trafficking among your military and police students?
Thank you. Yeah, the misconceptions are very interesting. It's that they believe that there is some, I think anyway, that there was some sense of knowledge by the victim in their own country, in their source country. And it's an idea that I think our police and military, because they are usually educated and well looked after people, both men and women, I think they can't put themselves in the other person's shoes. I hope that makes sense. And they are, the misconceptions are things like, well, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't be engaged in cyber conversations where I share so much personal information and so on. So one of the things that we have to do is talk to them about what risk these young people are really at. And technology facilitated crimes are very significant in that.
Okay, and the next question is from Sue. Thank you so much for the presentation.
My pleasure.
Since you mentioned vulnerability in conflict areas, would you have some recommendations on further sources if there's any statistics or papers that we could look for in the cases of Myanmar and Ukraine?
Yes. Is it all right if I provide those to you later, Pred? I've actually written a paper or a short list, excuse me, for our federal police to assist them when when the airports in Kabul fell, and I would very happily share that list with you and some of the articles that I'm aware of.
Absolutely. So we will make this information available on the news
Please.
section of our website. That would be great. Thank you so much. Any other questions for Amber? We have a few minutes remaining. Thank you, Amber, for taking so many questions like this.
That's okay.
If not, I'd just like to ask you maybe to explain. We touched on this just before just before the lecture, but could you explain a little bit about the work that you've done with Michelle, maybe in Thailand? I think that might be interesting as well for the participants.
Absolutely. And I was wondering, would it be all right with you if I asked Michelle to join us on screen? Um,
Absolutely,
Mish,
absolutely.
would you join us, please, if you're there? Hello. I'm going to mute myself, Mish. Would you like to take over for a sec?
Oh, good gracious. Okay. Hello. My name's Michelle. I'm the CEO of Global Arms, and I've been working with Amber, gosh, now for 3 years, I think. Yeah. We have been doing a lot of research on human trafficking cases. Global Arms runs a program called Yes She Matters, which is an emergency response program based in Masot Tak. So we handle a lot of gender-based violence and human trafficking cases, and we liaise with the police, working directly with them and the Ministry of Social Development and Human Security. Also, the local hospital here, like through the OSCC program, I don't know if you've heard about that, and immigration. So we've been doing a lot of research on the cases that Yes She Matters has been getting to try and follow trends, to try and work out the vulnerability and how people come to be trafficked in the first place. There's a lot of complex issues, especially coming out of Myanmar into Thailand. But recently, in the last 3 to 6 months, we've had quite a few cases coming from Myanmar, but of Chinese syndicates trafficking people from all over the world to Thailand and then into Myanmar. So it's definitely ongoing research, and it is increasing by the day.
It is. Mish, and I was going to say and add in here, we're looking at two different things. One of the is the role of women, and I'm sorry, I can't remember who asked the question, but talking about misconceptions is our police and military always considered women to be the victims and the gentlemen or the men to be the offenders. And what we have discovered is in a number of the nations, particularly in the Oceania area, women are more often the people in the markets. They are the buyers and sellers of products. So we actually find that we're certainly in terms of the convictions that have happened in Australia, the majority of them have had women as offenders. So Mish and I are writing a paper on that, and we're using those cases that stretch between Thailand and Australia, both in both of our court systems, to write about that. One of the things we have discovered is that in many cases the offenders were previous victims, which says a lot about psychology and those vulnerabilities. The other thing that we're doing in the future is we're going to try and do a collaborative study between Australia and Thailand, between our police agencies and so on. So Misha, I love you. I think your work is amazing, and I'm so happy to be doing it. But thank you for adding in.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you, Michelle, for your inputs there as well. But I really appreciate that, and for telling us more about your work there in Thailand. Are there any other questions? We probably have time for one more before closing. If you have time also, if I may just direct you to a link in the chat box there for your feedback on today's session, that would be great if you could just take a few seconds. It's a very short survey. Thank you so much. So, right, I don't see anything in the chat box. So, unfortunately, we have run out of time. It's the hour has flown by, but I'd like to say a big thank you to you, Dr. McKinley, for joining us as a guest speaker today, and for the really valuable insights and informative insights that you've shared with us. I'd like to thank everybody else for joining us today as well. And we do hope that you'll continue to find our webinar series useful and enjoyable. We're also, Dr. McKinley, I have to say, we look forward to reading your upcoming publication as well on conditional vulnerability, which sounds fascinating, next year. So we'll be following your work closely, and thank you for mentioning that you can make that available for us as well, so that we can share it with people who may have missed our session today as well.
And I just wanted to say thank you. It's an absolute honour to be asked by Thammasat University and the Faculty of Social Administration to do this presentation. But please, to all the participants, as I said, I rushed through, so I will make the majority of the presentation available for you to have, just with the removal of a couple of those photographs. But if there's any questions that come up later, or you are considering it as you write up or something like that, please feel free either to contact Pred, or if you Google me, you will find my contact details there, and I'm most happy to hear from you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Amber. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And wherever you are, stay safe and have a great rest of the week.
Excellent.
Thank you so much.
Good night. See you later.
Good night. Bye, Amber.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay.